from God and is traced back to him. Dr. Edith Eger, she was a Jewish girl, a lady born in Hungary, but she lives in the US now. And as a teen, she was sent to Auschwitz, and along with her parents and her sister. Her mum and dad were gassed, and Edith and her sister survived. After 8 months in that concentration camp, Edith, along with other prisoners, were moved to Austria. On the 4th of May 1945, a US soldier saw her hand move among a number of dead bodies, and he rescued her. Recently, she wrote, she's in her early 90s now, and I quote, "To celebrate the gift of life is to find the gift in everything that happens, even the parts that are difficult, that we are not sure we can survive. The struggle is the gold. If only we knew while it was happening that the hardest parts of life were good for us. Learn to see struggles as our victories," unquote. And I think Paul would add to that. He says in Romans 8:37, "Yet in all things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." Last week we heard about the awful struggles that Joseph endured. At what stage did he realize that God was in control? After the story last week, there were more highs and lows for him. And now as we come to chapter 50, Israel is dead, and Joseph is grieving for his dad and grieving the loss of the years spent with him and that were cruelly robbed from him and from his father. So Genesis 50, verse 1, Joseph threw himself on his father and wept over him and kissed him. Our phone rang at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's about 20 years ago. It was my brother-in-law to tell me that my dad had died. We were here, this was in Ireland. I know what it's like to lose your dad. I cried, I grieved. I know Joseph's pain. Unlike my dad, Sidney, who died suddenly and unexpectedly, Joseph's dad, Israel, had time to call all 12 of his sons together to bless them or prophesy over them. And Donna has just mentioned about those prophecies, and I'm just going to read from Genesis 49, beginning at verse 22. I'm going to read just the prophecy that he had for Joseph. Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring whose branches climb over a wall. With bitterness, archers attacked him. They shot at him with hostility. Lewis told us about some of Joseph's story last week and the cruelty of his brothers. But then later in his story, there were others who betrayed him, and you can read more about that in Genesis 39:41. But Israel continues, "But his bow remained steady. His strong arm stayed limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of the sky above, blessings of the deep springs below, blessings of the breast and womb. Your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of the age-old hills. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. Israel acknowledges that the whole reason for Joseph's success was because of God, because of God, because of God the Almighty. So many times in his life he was alone and suffering unjustly. He was dumped in an ungodly culture against his will. He didn't have a lovely church fellowship like Oates to call on, to ask for prayer. He was alone, but God was weaving his plan the whole time. There are many Christians today who have been dumped in prison or abused for their faith. They're being cut off from their family, and like Joseph, sometimes by their family, for their faith in Jesus. Let us pray for them. Let us pray that they might know the mighty one of Jacob, the rock, the Almighty, our God, also ministering and delivering them. And may they be encouraged to know that God is working out his plan in seemingly impossible situations. After the blessing, and then he blesses Benjamin, and then he says, this is Israel in verse 29 of chapter 49. He says to the sons, I am about to be gathered to my people. I'm about to die, I quite like that. I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham brought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah, but not Rachel. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So if we move on to chapter 50, back to chapter 50, Joseph directed the physicians in verse 2 to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Honoring your father was in Joseph's DNA. Maybe Joseph didn't realize how poor a role model his dad was, how he displayed favoritism, not just in his earlier years, but even in that lesson we've just read, the prince among his brothers. His brothers' hatred of him was fueled by their dad, but that is all past, and a dad is a dad, and whether he's good or bad, Joseph was going to honor his dad. He organized for his dad to be embalmed, which took 40 days, and the Egyptians held the father of Joseph in such high regard that they mourned for Israel 70 days. Now that's extraordinary, because a pharaoh was mourned 72 days. The nearest we have seen to this was in our time in New Zealand, was the taming for the Maori Queen way back in August 2016. But that was only a total of about 6 days. Some of you know Christina and Prabhu. Christina was a student at East West, and they work with in an Aboriginal community in Arnhem Land. And when they talk about funerals there that last for weeks, and it's such a big thing. But when the days of mourning had passed, 70 days, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, "If I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear an oath and said, I am about to die, bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father, then I will return. Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do." So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court and all the dignitaries of Egypt, besides all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and their herds were left in Goshen. Chariots and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company. Israel's funeral was a state one, and his burial is probably the most highly detailed and high-ranking funeral in all of the Bible. Pharaoh provided a royal bodyguard for their safety. Remember, it was a time of famine and desperation, and so there was every fear that that group could be looted. So when they reached the threshing floor of Atad near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly, and there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning." That is why that place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim, which means the mourning of Egypt. So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. The sons had often disappointed their dad in his life, but here, in his death, they were honoring him. And after burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury their father. And what happens next? When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" You can hold a grudge for a long time and wait until that time is just right. Joseph could have carried a grudge, and no one would have blamed him or judged him. He was treated cruelly and violently, and both Joseph and his dad were robbed of precious years. We heard that vividly last week. So the brothers sent word to Joseph saying,
"Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father."
Were they lying again? Were they playing on Joseph's love for his dad when they sent Joseph that message? What has changed? Were they afraid? Why didn't they go in person? Were they tugging at Joseph's heartstrings? Were they lying again? Maybe they hadn't moved on. They were still bound by their old thinking and guilt. Their old reaction of lying and deceit had surfaced again. Were they playing on Joseph's love for his dad when they sent Joseph the message? Forgive them. No matter what they have done, well, that covers everything. Did Jacob know what they did? What has changed? Their dad is dead. Were they afraid? Of course. What was the first question that Joseph asked his brothers when he revealed himself way back in Genesis 45? He said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" Why didn't they go in person? Was it because maybe Joseph didn't speak directly to Pharaoh, so maybe they thought, oh, we should, because of Joseph's position, should go through somebody else? But then they had just travelled back with him. Maybe they were following protocol. Were they scared? Remember Uncle Esau and their dad's story, how Jacob tricked his brother. Genesis 27 has that story. And verse 41 and 27 says, Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. Were they tugging at Joseph's heartstrings? Were the brothers more concerned about their skin, their future, than displaying remorse for their actions? So when their message came to him, Joseph wept. Why did Joseph weep? Did it remind him of the awful time when they betrayed him and they put him in the pit, the time we heard about last week? Or did it remind him or show him how little he was loved and trusted? Or is he gutted that in all of this, they still don't see God's hand at work? They still don't see that God is going to fulfill his promise. They don't have that faith. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. That was a dream coming true, wasn't it? But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Surely it would have been better to be slaves than to be executed. We're happy to be your slaves. They were in fear of execution. Joseph was now free to take revenge, and it would have been very easy to do in his position. But Joseph's identity is always in God. We have seen how God has led Joseph through many high, low situations in his life, but working out his master plan. But here Joseph tells his brothers as it is. He calls sin out for what it is. He says there are two very opposing intentions in what happened. You intended to harm me, God intended it for good. Evil was traced back to the brothers, and good was traced back and is always traced back to God. He doesn't say he forgives them now, does he? But he points them back to God. Am I in the place of God? For forgiveness, you're looking in the wrong place, asking the wrong person. That's God's domain. But having said that, his response was radical. He had compassion on his brothers. He showed kindness. What a contrast to what we heard last week. Genesis 37:4. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had now broken that cycle of hatred. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. You know, throughout Genesis we've seen lots of family conflicts, brothers fighting, but Joseph has overcome that conflict. Through Joseph we see how God is breaking the curse. Reconciliation instead of violence, kindness instead of hatred, blessing, not cursing. Joseph's life shows that God wastes no experiences, that there is a gift in everything that happens. His story displays God, how God puts himself in impossible situations and yet finds ways to keep his promise. Here, taking a young guy rejected by his brothers, alone, a slave, and using him to fulfill that promise. Last week and today has mostly been about Joseph's story, but the working out of his story is all about God himself. It's about how God keeps his promise. And now, nearing his death, he reminds his brothers and family of the hope they have in God, that God will fulfill his promise to their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because of the powerful position that Joseph is in, he could have had a grand burial site, could have had a pyramid. Instead, he asks for his bones to be carried to the promised land when God brings them to it. His faith is even greater than that of Jacob's, because he is sure that God, in his own time, will fulfill the promise. Joseph was using this last opportunity that he had with his family to encourage them in their faith that God was in control. And Marion Riddell said some very powerful words at her dad's funeral, and I quote with her permission. It was a privilege to have spent the last weeks of his life with him and learning yet another lesson from my dad. I learned how to die with dignity and embrace it, something that you could never learn unless you see it for yourself. He was looking forward to going to be with his wife and family that have already died. He had his ticket and was waiting for the train to come. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Last week, Linda reminded us about how Joseph is remembered in the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when he was about to die, confidently spoke of God's bringing the people of Israel out of Egypt. He was so sure of it that he commanded them to carry his bones with them when they left. Joseph's story is the story of glory through suffering, exaltation through humiliation, breaking the power of sin, of generational sins. It's a forerunner of the cross and the crown. On the cross, those who delivered Jesus up to be crucified intended to harm him, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph pointed his brothers to God, but Jesus went one step further and interceded for his tormentors. Luke 23:34 says, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Jesus became the sacrifice for our sin. Today, he intercedes on our behalf. The story of Joseph is the story of the mighty one of Jacob, the shepherd, the rock of Israel, our God, the Almighty, and his wonderful plan for redemption for all peoples. Our calling is the same as Joseph's, to simply be faithful where he has and in what way we can, in our times of ease or struggle, of uncertainty or certainty. We, like Joseph, have a great hope because of Jesus. Amen.